I've spent 22 years in the courtroom, first as a prosecutor, then as a judge. In all that time, I thought I'd seen every kind of outburst, every breakdown of order. I was wrong. That Monday started like any other. I arrived at the downtown courthouse early, black robe in hand, gavel polished, ready to preside over a high-profile pretrial hearing. The defendant was a former city contractor accused of embezzlement. The gallery was filled, reporters, attorneys, curious citizens, and a few plainclothes officers stationed around the room due to past threats made against the court. But the man who would soon shock the nation wasn't undercover. He was uniformed. Officer Caleb Rusk. Tall. Imposing. Known around city departments as a no-nonsense enforcer. He wasn't scheduled to testify or participate, only assigned for courtroom security. Or so I thought. It was 20 minutes into the proceedings when things shifted. Defense counsel had made a motion I'd already ruled on once before. I reminded her firmly, this motion has been addressed, and unless there's new cause, the court sees no need to revisit. That's when it happened. From behind the rail, Officer Rusk suddenly took 2 heavy steps forward. His voice cut through the courtroom like a blade, "She's twisting the law. Are you just going to sit there?" Gasps spread across the room like wildfire. I stood up slowly, trying to maintain the dignity of the bench. "Officer Rusk, you are out of line. Return to your post." He didn't. Instead, he reached the judge's bench in 3 strides. And before anyone could react, his open palm struck the side of my face. The room froze. For a full 2 seconds, the silence was absolute. Then chaos erupted. The crack of the slap still echoed as my vision pulsed. I steadied myself against the bench, heart pounding, not from pain, but from disbelief. Gasps turned to screams. The bailiff lunged, but Officer Rusk was already stepping back, his chest heaving, eyes wild. "You've let this court turn into a circus," he shouted, trying to justify the unthinkable. "I won't watch it happen again." The courtroom was in pandemonium. Attorneys scrambled. Reporters dove for their phones. My clerk rushed to my side, but I raised a hand to stop her. I wouldn't fall. Not here. Not in front of this man. "Officer Rusk," I said, steady and deliberate, "you are under arrest for assaulting a sitting judge." The other officers in the courtroom hesitated. A split second of uncertainty. Then, to my relief, 2 of them, Detectives Cortez and Ng, sprang into action. They tackled him down hard, wrenching his arms behind his back. "You're making a mistake." Rusk barked as cuffs were slapped on. "They're all gonna see, she doesn't belong up there." That was it. The line. The crack beneath the surface that gave him away. I turned to the gallery. Cameras were now rolling. Microphones pointed. The entire nation would see exactly what just happened. Not twisted or edited. Not manipulated. Pure, unfiltered truth. The courtroom cleared swiftly after that. Rusk was dragged out the side entrance, still yelling. I stepped away from the bench just long enough for medics to check my cheek. A faint red mark. Nothing serious. But the damage he'd done to himself? Irreparable. And by lunchtime, the headlines had begun. By noon, every major outlet had the footage. Courtroom chaos, officer strikes sitting judge during live hearing. Security officer detained after assaulting judge in packed courtroom. The clips were relentless. There I was, standing in black robes, calm and composed. And there he was, lunging forward, striking me across the face before being tackled by his own colleagues. The nation saw it unfiltered. Raw. Unjustifiable. What followed was swift and unprecedented. The city's police commissioner held a press conference within hours. I watched from chambers as she stood stiffly at the podium, her voice tight. Effective immediately, Officer Caleb Rusk has been suspended without pay pending investigation. The department does not condone, nor will it ever tolerate, acts of aggression against court officials or any member of the public. But that wasn't enough for the public. Demonstrators were already gathering outside by late afternoon. Some were furious, others stunned. Not because an officer had crossed the line, but because he'd done it so brazenly, in a courtroom, with cameras rolling, knowing full well who I was. The mayor's office issued a statement by sundown, calling it a disgraceful breach of public trust. Internally, I knew they were scrambling. No one wanted to be caught on the wrong side of this moment. That evening, I sat alone in my chambers. I replayed the strike in my mind. Not out of fear, but out of calculation. Because this wasn't over. Rusk's words, his timing, his fury, they weren't spontaneous. They felt directed. Strategic. Like he thought he had permission. And if that was true, I needed to find out who gave it to him. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. The building was quieter than it had been in years. No chatter in the halls. No hurried heels on marble. Just a few nervous glances from staff as I passed. The chief administrative judge requested a meeting before I even took the bench. She offered support, apologized on behalf of the judiciary, and encouraged me to take a leave of absence. I declined. If anything, Rusk's outburst had confirmed one thing: someone wanted me off the bench. That made me even more determined to stay exactly where I was. Before returning to my courtroom, I reviewed the incident report filed overnight by Detectives Cortez and Ng. It was thorough, too thorough. They noted that Rusk wasn't officially scheduled for courtroom duty that day. His assignment had been a city council meeting across town. He had requested the courtroom shift last minute, with no explanation. And the request had been approved. By whom? I flipped the page. One name stood out: Lieutenant Garvey, head of courthouse security. An old-school officer with plenty of political ties and a reputation for quietly pulling strings. I had ruled against one of his close friends, a retired contractor, in a public corruption case just 3 months prior. That case hadn't gone over well with certain circles in the city. Suddenly, Rusk's rant about me, twisting the law, felt less like passion and more like a rehearsed accusation. Like someone had planted that idea in his mind. I pushed the report aside and looked out my office window, where protest signs now waved just beyond the gates. But they weren't just about Officer Rusk anymore. They were about what allowed him to feel invincible in the first place. This wasn't just a personal attack. It was the first crack in something much deeper. And I was going to pull the whole thread loose. I made one call. Not to the mayor. Not to the media. To a quiet, relentless force I'd trusted for years, U.S. Attorney Dana Carlisle. We'd worked together before, back when I was still a prosecutor. She had no tolerance for internal games, especially when those games threatened the integrity of the courts. I didn't mince words. Dana, something bigger is happening. Rusk wasn't rogue. He was placed. I need help before this gets buried. She didn't hesitate. Give me a day. While she mobilized, I returned to the bench. Cameras now filled the gallery, and every seat was taken. People wanted to see what would happen next, whether I'd flinch, or fold, or falter. I didn't. I opened court precisely at 9 a.m. and proceeded as if the slap never happened. Because for justice to work, it has to keep moving, even when it's wounded. But behind the scenes, something was brewing. That evening, Dana's office issued subpoenas to the courthouse's internal scheduling system. She quietly initiated a federal inquiry into possible obstruction, abuse of authority, and conspiracy to influence judicial decisions. And just like that, the silence began to break. By week's end, whispers were turning to full-throated accusations. Several courthouse officers admitted they'd been pressured to ignore Rusk's unsanctioned post. One clerk revealed that records had been quietly altered, deleting his name from the original assignment roster. And most damning of all, a voicemail from Lieutenant Garvey surfaced. In it, his voice could be heard muttering to a colleague, "If she keeps ruling the way she does, someone's going to have to remind her who runs this courthouse." That was all Dana needed. And it was all I'd feared. Because now it was clear, the slap was never about anger. It was a message. And they were about to find out, they sent it to the wrong judge. By the following Monday, headlines had shifted. What began as a shocking courtroom assault was now unraveling into a full-blown conspiracy. News anchors spoke in clipped, urgent tones. Federal investigation launched into alleged plot to intimidate sitting judge. Voicemail suggests court security chief knew of officer's plan. Inside the courthouse, there was panic. Garvey hadn't shown up for work since the subpoenas dropped. Rusk was still in federal custody, now refusing to speak without immunity. The DA's office, embarrassed and furious, launched their own review to avoid being accused of complacency. And as for me, I did what I always do, I worked. But this time, I was armed with more than just a gavel. I was working with Dana's team behind the scenes, helping map out the internal networks that allowed men like Garvey to operate unchecked for so long. Some of the connections stunned even me: retired city council members, real estate developers, private security contractors, all tied together by quiet favors, rigged contracts, and backroom pressure. They didn't want justice. They wanted control. Control over who sat on the bench. Control over which cases made it to trial. And most importantly, control over who lost power when the truth finally came out. The truth had started to bleed. And now, there was no patching the wound. That Friday, the biggest break came. Dana's investigators uncovered encrypted text messages between Rusk and Garvey. The day before the assault, Garvey had written, "You don't have to hurt her. Just rattle her. Let her know the robe doesn't make her untouchable." But Rusk had replied, "Too late. She needs to feel it." There it was, intent, coordination, and arrogance in writing. The public saw it all. The protests grew. Citizens rallied not just for me, but for every judge, lawyer, and court worker who had ever been silently pressured or threatened behind closed doors. And in that moment, the slap became more than an act of violence. It became a turning point. On Monday morning, Lieutenant Garvey was arrested outside his lakeside home. Federal agents led him out in handcuffs, still wearing his department-issued jacket. The image hit every news station by noon. I watched from chambers as they replayed it on loop, the man who thought he ran the courthouse, now silent, cuffed, and surrounded. That same afternoon, Dana walked into my office with a stack of sealed indictments. 12 names, she said quietly. It runs deeper than we thought. Contractors, ex-councilmen, even a deputy city manager. They all signed off on decisions meant to keep us, in check. My jaw tightened. They hadn't just targeted me. They'd been pulling strings for years, adjusting court schedules, funneling cases, and intimidating officials who didn't rule their way. Rusk's slap had been the spark, but the fire was already there. Waiting. By Wednesday, I was called to testify in front of a closed federal ethics panel. For over 3 hours, I recounted not just the assault, but the whispers, the pressure, the quiet retaliation I'd ignored or endured for years. I laid it all out. And when I left that room, something in me felt different. Lighter. Sharper. Determined. The court reconvened that Friday. As I walked in, every seat was taken, not by protesters or press, but by fellow judges. Men and women in robes who had flown in from across the state to stand behind me. I took the bench. Silence. Then applause. It rolled through the courtroom like thunder, restrained but powerful. Not for me alone, but for the principle that no robe should be bowed by fear. That justice does not flinch when struck. I raised the gavel, let the room fall quiet, and said, "This court is back in session." And this time, they knew I wasn't the one on trial. Within a month, the fallout was national. Legal watchdog groups began demanding reforms. Not just in my city, but in courtrooms across the country. Security protocols were reviewed. Oversight of courthouse personnel was tightened. And most critically, the conversation shifted from fear of retaliation to accountability for those who abused power in the shadows. Officer Rusk? He accepted a plea deal, felony assault of a judicial officer and conspiracy to obstruct justice. 5 years in federal prison. No parole. Lieutenant Garvey? He went to trial. The evidence, text messages, voicemails, falsified records, painted a clear picture of a man who thought he was untouchable. The jury didn't need long. Guilty on all counts. His sentencing was poetic. Delivered by a colleague of mine, Judge Warner, who simply said, "You mistook this courthouse for a kingdom. It never belonged to you." And it didn't. In the months that followed, I was approached repeatedly to write op-eds, do interviews, accept speaking engagements. But I declined most of them. Because while the nation had watched a courtroom scandal unfold, I had lived through a reckoning. Not just against one man, or one corrupt officer, but against an entire culture that believed pressure and intimidation were normal, even necessary, tools of influence. What they didn't expect was resistance. And not just from me. From the system itself. From a community that stood up and said enough. 6 months after the incident, I sat down in front of a quiet crowd at a legal symposium in D.C. I hadn't planned to speak, just attend, observe. But the panel moderator spotted me in the audience and asked if I'd be willing to offer a few words. I stood up, walked to the microphone, and looked out across a sea of black robes and polished name tags. Then I said, I wasn't assaulted because I was a judge. I was assaulted because I wouldn't play along. And that distinction matters. You could feel the room tighten, not in discomfort, but in recognition. For years, some of us have pretended these things only happen in the shadows, behind closed chambers, in whispered phone calls, over drinks with donors. But the moment someone walked up to the bench and raised a hand to a sitting judge, they dragged that darkness into the light. I paused. And once it's in the light, you don't get to look away. The applause wasn't thunderous. It was deliberate. Measured. But afterward, dozens came to me, judges, clerks, law students, to say they'd felt pressure too. Subtle. Creeping. Unspoken. And they were done tolerating it. The moment had become a movement. The Department of Justice launched a national review of judicial intimidation cases. New legislation was drafted that mandated stricter oversight for courthouse staffing and security clearances. A task force was created to protect judges from internal coercion as much as from external threats. And as for me, I stayed exactly where I belonged. On the bench. Gavel in hand. Eyes forward. 1 year to the day after the slap, I walked back into the same courtroom, same bench, same wooden gavel, same high ceilings echoing with quiet history. But something had changed. Not just in me. In all of us. The seat wasn't heavier anymore. It was steadier. Firmer. The weight of fear had been replaced by something stronger, clarity. Outside, a new plaque had been installed at the courthouse entrance. Not in my name. But in recognition of the moment that forced an entire system to look inward. It read, "In honor of those who upheld the rule of law when it was most under attack, not by chaos, but by quiet compromise. Justice stands firm, because someone refused to move." I didn't ask for it. I didn't need it. But I was proud it was there. The courtroom was packed that morning, not because of drama or scandal, but because it had become a symbol of resilience. Students visited. Officials came through in silence. Tourists snapped photos of the bench where one man tried to send a message, and got one back instead. A lasting one. As court convened, I tapped the gavel lightly and looked out at the faces before me. Calm. attentive, respectful. And I knew, no matter how much pressure they tried to apply, no matter how bold they'd become behind closed doors, it had all come undone with a single, arrogant mistake. They thought silence would protect them. Instead, the strike that was meant to intimidate ended up triggering one of the most public reckonings our courts had seen in decades. They underestimated the robe. They underestimated the room. And most of all, they underestimated me.